Matthew's Gospel, Jewish or anti-Jewish? In St. Matthew's Gospel, Jesus is being tried before Pilate, with the crowd demanding his crucifixion and the release of Barabbas. Pilate famously washes his hands and proclaims, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." All the people then give this terrible answer: "His blood be on us and upon our children." This verse has been used down the ages to justify pogroms and persecutions of Jewish people. One of the worst justification was Martin Luther's. This is what he wrote: "The Jews got what they deserved. They'd been called and elected to be God's mouth. They, however, kept tightly closed their muzzles, eyes, ears, nose, whole heart, and all senses. They smack their lips like swine. That is how they wanted. Call more, crucify him, scream more, his blood come upon us and upon our children." Perhaps one of the merciful saints among Christians may think I'm behaving too crude and disdainfully against the poor, miserable Jews in that I deal with them so sarcastically and insulting. But good God, I am much too mild in insulting such devils. Martin Luther was invoked by the Nazis for the justification of their so-called Jewish solution, the attempted extermination of all Jewish people in Europe. Christians should be penitent about the way that the words put into the mouth of the crowd have been used by Christians to justify anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. Not surprisingly, Jews have reacted with distaste to Matthew's Gospel, seeing it as anti-Jewish, the justification for pogroms down the ages. But there is a paradox here. Christians see Matthew's Gospel as the most Jewish of all Gospels. Is there a way to hold these two views in tension and perhaps come out with more understanding? Matthew wrote his Gospel for a predominantly Jewish Christian community. He records the mission of Jesus as almost exclusively to the people of Israel. When Jesus sends out the 12 disciples on their mission, he makes it clear that they should go only to the people of Israel and not to the Gentiles or the Samaritans. He says, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Moreover, Matthew's Jesus is seen to uphold the Torah, the Jewish law found in the first 5 books of the Hebrew Scriptures. In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says this: "Think not that I have come to abolish the law and the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is fulfilled." Indeed, some have detected in Jesus having 5 big teaching blocks in Matthew's Gospel, a mirroring of the 5 books of the Torah. In the same way that Moses received the law on the mountain, so Jesus went up on the mountain to deliver his great Sermon on the Mount. Other parallels can be made between Moses, the supposed author of the Torah, and Jesus, particularly in Matthew's infancy narrative. Similarly, Matthew seeks to portray Jesus not only as the successor, but also as a greater person than King David. Jesus is known as the Son of David, but he's also the Son of God. There's one striking parallel in the stories of David and Jesus. Their respective betrayers, Ahithophel and Judas, both hang themselves in shame. Matthew's community kept their allegiance to the Torah at a time when other Christians were lessening their attachment. His community was seeking to maintain their Jewish identity and was supported by his gospel in doing so. So we need to be careful in our language before we accuse Matthew of being anti-Jewish. He was Jewish through and through, and we must look at the problematic sayings in the gospel in that light. We have seen the lasting effects of that terrible phrase on the people calling blood upon themselves and their children. This is not an isolated saying. Matthew is generally scornful of Jews who have not accepted Christ, and especially the Jewish leaders. For example, how do we interpret the story of the curse of the fig tree, which is found in both Matthew's and Mark's Gospels? Having entered Jerusalem, Jesus curses the barren fig tree, saying, "May no fruit ever come from you again." Is this curse on the people of Jerusalem, who are not going to accept the message of the kingdom and are therefore not going to produce its fruits? Having not accepted the gospel, are the two gospel writers saying that the people are cursed? We can draw a similar conclusion when we read the parable of the wicked tenants, also found in Mark and Luke. We are told that the tenants who have legally taken over the vineyard will come to a miserable death. Jesus says that the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a nation producing the fruits of it. This was a judgment on the people of Jerusalem who hadn't accepted Jesus and brought about his crucifixion. Not surprisingly, the chief priests and the Pharisees realized that the parable was aimed at them. In Matthew's Gospel, particular invective is reserved for the Pharisees, Sadducees, and scribes. John the Baptist called Pharisees and Sadducees coming for baptism a brood of vipers. Later on in the Gospel, Jesus pronounces woe on the scribes and Pharisees 7 times. He calls them serpents and brood of vipers. What's going on? Let us look first at those who these officials were, before we looked at why they attracted such a lashing from Matthew's tongue. The Sadducees were a priestly party running the temple and had reached some accommodation with the Roman authorities. In the Gospels, they seek to catch Jesus out. Of course, of that party, the chief priest and the high priest were involved in delivering Jesus to the Roman authorities for execution. So it's not difficult to see why they are criticized in the Gospel. But the temple was destroyed in 70 of the Christian era. Their raison d'etre in maintaining the temple cult also ended, and they ceased to exist as a group. Scribes were a less homogeneous group. They were a professional class and interpreters of the Torah. Some acted as court clerks to the Sanhedrin. Others were aligned with the Pharisees or Sadducees. They argue with Jesus over points of law, such as the authority to forgive. But not every scribe should be seen as acting in a hostile manner to Jesus, who says, "Therefore every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." Was Matthew being autobiographical? Was he such a scribe? Pharisees get an extremely bad press in the New Testament. In popular parlance, Pharisaic means at best being legalistic in interpreting the law and at worst hypocritical. This can easily morph into anti-Semitism when people label Jews as Pharisaic. The danger is that we read the New Testament with this stereotypical lens, rather than trying to work out what is really going on. At the time of Jesus, the Pharisees were one of the main religious parties. They were not so much legalistic, but argumentative about the interpretation of the Torah and also the oral law, particularly on purity, which they maintained, while the Sadducees did not. The name Pharisee might derive from them separating from the Sadducees. They probably shared more in common with Jesus than the Sadducees. After all, they shared a belief with Jesus in the resurrection and a future age in which justice would be established. We shouldn't rush into premature judgments on Pharisees. In Luke's Gospel, some Pharisees went out of their way to warn Jesus that Herod wanted to kill him. According to the Synoptic Gospels, the Pharisees did not involve themselves in the death of Jesus. The Pharisee Gamaliel warns the Sanhedrin to be careful before condemning the apostles. Some Pharisees were actually Christians. Furthermore, some of the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin took Paul's side when he appeared before that body. Nor should we think that the Pharisees were particularly strict in their observance of the Torah. They had a reputation for leniency, both in adhering to the Torah and in punishing disobedience. While Paul may have been a Pharisee, it's unlikely that he inherited his persecuting zeal from that tradition. Before we move on, we can ask whether Matthew was at one time a Pharisee, in the light of the concerns he expresses in the Gospel about obedience to the Torah. This leads us into an intriguing question. Why do the Pharisees in Matthew's Gospel get such a bad press when their involvement was comparatively benign compared to the Sadducees? Before turning to that issue, we must ascertain when the Gospel was written, because that will clear up much of the uncertainty. You will not be surprised that the date of the Gospel is the subject of much academic dispute. The question is whether the Gospel was written before or after the sack of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Christian era. My own view is that the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were all written after 70 CE. My reason is quite simple. The three Gospels all predict the destruction brought about by the Romans. In all three Gospels, Jesus predicts the destruction of the temple. All three Gospels advise fleeing from the city to the mountains, when the time of desolation is at hand. Matthew and Mark speak in code about the sign being the desolating sacrifice spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place. Luke is explicit. It's when Jerusalem is besieged by armies. Some argue that Jesus or the gospel writers were able to predict these events. You must take your own view, but for me, it's far more likely that the gospel writers knew these events had taken place and commented on their significance. As we shall see, so much falls into place if my view is correct. We need to reflect how devastating the destruction of the temple was. The whole sacrificial system of the Judean religion wasn't at end. The focus of the Jewish identity was taken away. The early pilgrimages were no more. Families could not go up to Jerusalem to sacrifice. The great Passover sacrifice, which we read about in the Gospels, could no longer happen in Jerusalem. Was the Jewish religion at an end? How should the destruction be interpreted? Matthew was sure that the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple was brought about by God as punishment for the Jews in Jerusalem for not following Jesus. We see this in his description of Jesus' lament over Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, killing the prophets and stoning those who are sent to you, how often would I have gathered your children together, as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is forsaken and desolate. The destruction is foreshadowed in the tearing of the temple curtain on the death of Jesus. Access to God will no longer be through the temple cult, but through Jesus. The old Jewish religion based on temple worship had been, in Matthew's eyes, superseded by the Jewish movement. This was further borne out by the later destruction of the temple and Jerusalem. In seeing the destruction of the temple and Jerusalem in 70 CE as a punishment from God, Matthew is following the ancient prophets who saw the forced exile into Babylon from Jerusalem as a punishment for forsaking God. Matthew is acting in the long prophetic tradition in Israel. Matthew wasn't alone in claiming that Jerusalem was destroyed because of the sin of the people. In an apocalyptic writing known as 4 Baruch, the question is asked, why was Jerusalem made desolate? For the sins of the beloved people, she was delivered into the hands of the enemies for our sins and those of the people. This enables to put into context the awful cry of the people, his blood be upon us and our children. Matthew, as in 4 Baruch, was blaming the destruction on the sins of the people. But for him, the specific sin of responsibility for Christ's death. The punishment was meted out on the people of Jerusalem present at Christ's crucifixion and the next generation. The cry is related to the events of 70 CE and has no bearing thereafter for any vicarious responsibility. The cry must not be used to pin responsibility on Jews for Christ's death in succeeding centuries. So what happens to Christians and Jews after 70 CE? In the first century, There were many sects in Israel. Each one had its own characteristics and were often opposed to each other. They often denigrated the other sects in their scriptures. We have already come across the Sadducees and the Pharisees, as well as the nation Christian communities. In addition, there were the followers of John the Baptist, who were in competition with the followers of Christ, despite the airing out of differences in the New Testament. There was the rigorous community of the Essenes, far stricter than the Pharisees, with their own scriptures and temple customs, which we've learnt about in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Samaritans had their own temple at Mount Gerizim. The Zealots started a movement leading to the revolt against Rome. Sectarian groups each thought themselves to be a righteous minority and were in enmity with the main leadership of the day. After the destruction of Jerusalem, Christians saw themselves as successors of the Jewish religion, which had, in their eyes, been destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. We see this in the letter to the Hebrews, which proclaims that Christ's sacrifice on the cross has replaced the sacrificial cult described in the Torah. The Levitical system of sacrifice was now abolished to establish the offering of Christ. Christ's sacrifice meant that Matthew's Jewish Christians were the successors to the old Jewish religion. Not surprisingly, not everyone saw things in this way. The Pharisees and scribes got their act together and started to lead a mainstream Jewish movement based on home and synagogue worship rather than ritual sacrifice. It was this formative Jewish movement which eventually successfully emerged as modern Judaism. At some stage, the leaders pushed Christians out of this movement by expelling them from the synagogues. They were claiming that Christians could no longer be considered Jewish for various reasons, one of which was lax observance of the Torah. That is the reason why Matthew was so keen to insist that the Torah was not abrogated in his community. So we see two things going on. Christians claiming to be the successors of Judaism, and the Pharisees claiming that they were the true successors and the Christians had no part to play in the Jewish community surviving the destruction of the temple. Formative Judaism is gaining the upper hand, which may explain the frustration behind so much invective in Matthew's Gospel. This explains why Matthew hurled such invective against the scribes and the Pharisees. We have seen at the time of Jesus and Paul, the Pharisees were not Christians' principal enemies, and some were indeed tolerant of the new movement. But after 70 CE, Pharisees and scribes had become the leaders of the main Jewish sect or formative Judaism, rivaling the Christians and expelling them from synagogues. In this changed situation, Matthew fulminates against Pharisees and denigrates them with flowering denunciations. We have the sevenfold, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." At some stage, formative Judaism of the Pharisees and scribes starts to become based on the synagogue and led by rabbis. How this happened is shrouded by myth and mystery. The process may already have started when Matthew wrote his Gospel, hence the prohibition on calling anyone rabbi, which is made more poignant when Judas betrays Jesus, calling him rabbi. Matthew's language against the Pharisees reminds us more of the school playground than the teacher's common room. How should we view it? This is the language that sectarian Jews wrote about each other, what we might today call unparliamentary language. Criticism of Jewish leadership has a long pedigree, as this extract from the Psalms of Solomon shows. Why are you sitting in the council of the devout, you profaner? And your heart is far from the Lord, provoking the God of Israel with law-breaking. He himself is guilty of a variety of sins and intemperance. His eyes are on every woman indiscriminately. His tongue lies, swearing such a contract. May God remove from the devout those who live in hypocrisy. May his flesh decay and his life be impoverished. Strong stuff indeed. In attacking the Jewish leadership, Matthew was following a well-worn path. Matthew's Christians were battling it out with the Pharisee party to be the successors to Israel now the temple and Jerusalem had been destroyed. Matthew constantly makes the point that Christ is the culmination of the yearnings of the Hebrew scriptures, and at the same time is not averse to claiming his opponents have no place in the new dispensation. Throughout the Gospel, Matthew tells us that things happen to fulfill the scriptures. As a result of carol service, the most famous example is the description of the Annunciation to Mary by the angel, found in Luke's Gospel. Matthew adds, all this took place to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet. Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and his name shall be called Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew is using a proof text from the Old Testament or Hebrew scriptures to convince his hearers that the birth of Jesus was all part of a divine plan which had been foretold by the prophet Isaiah. Matthew took the text of the Greek Old Testament, known as the Septuagint, to make his point. The Hebrew has different wording, which is likely to be translated as, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son and shall name him Emmanuel. Today, we find the swapping of proof text to make a religious point rather unconvincing, but it was characteristic of the rhetoric of the time as testified by the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was unlikely to convince Jews who were increasingly looking to the Hebrew scriptures as authority and rejecting the Septuagint. Nevertheless, Matthew's point was that Jesus was the Christ who had been predicted in the ancient scriptures. Jesus had fulfilled the prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures. He may have asked, what was the purpose of a Judaism which did not acknowledge Christ? Matthew would have said that it was under God's judgment. In Matthew's Gospel, we can witness another tension which may help explain his antipathy to the Jewish elite. Throughout the Gospel, there is a contrast between Nazareth and Judea. Judea is often associated with danger, whereas Nazareth is associated with safety. The family of Jesus flee from Bethlehem in view of Herod's desire to kill him. They return to Nazareth, being concerned that the ruler, Archelaus, was now in charge of Judea. This was to fulfill a prophetic saying, which no one has been able to locate. He shall be called a Nazarene. After John the Baptist is arrested, Jesus goes to Galilee, where he first calls his disciples. The drama starts again when Jesus enters Judea at the end of his ministry. Jesus enters Jerusalem with a Nazarene crowd who explain to the city's inhabitants that this is the prophet from Jesus from Nazareth of Galilee. It was the city's crowd who demanded Jesus' death, not his Nazarene followers who were scared out of their minds. They forsook Jesus and fled at his arrest. They remain in danger. Peter is nearly arrested because he has a Nazarene accent. Peter is being accused of associating with Jesus of Nazareth and Jesus the Galilean. There was evidently some tension between Galilee and Nazareth, rather like the north-south divide in England. Judea had all the wealth. Nazareth was much poorer. After the collapse of Jerusalem in 70 CE, we can guess that the Judean elite started taking over positions of responsibility in the diaspora. If that is right, it would further explain the antipathy which Matthew felt towards the scribes and the Pharisees. Matthew may well have written for a Christian community in Galilee or in Antioch, Syria. It's likely to have been composed of many who were from the people of Israel, who may well have had some prejudice against those coming from Judea. The tension between Nazareth and Judea may have continued after the sack of Jerusalem between exiled Pharisee members of the Judean elite and the emerging Christian movement in the diaspora. This may be a good time to look at the word of Jew in Matthew's Gospel and what it may mean. In the New Testament, we have the word Judean, which English Bibles usually translate as Jew. Like the English, the term Judean has multiple meanings, from a resident in Judea to those who are members of the people of Israel, including those in the diaspora. But Matthew is sparing in using the term. He uses the term about those who believed that the body of Jesus had been stolen by his disciples. Otherwise, only the Magi, Pilate, and the Roman soldiers referred to Jesus as King of the Jews. This may explain a prejudice against the people in Jerusalem and Judea. Whatever the causes, Matthew's Jewish community starts to turn its attention towards the Gentiles. We see this with hints dropped during the Gospel that salvation is available outside the Jewish matrix. The Gospel starts with a genealogy with 3 or possibly 4 Gentile women included: Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and possibly Tamar. The Oriental magicians do homage to Jesus. The centurion shows his faith in Jesus more than anyone in Israel. The Canaanite woman shows great faith. Another centurion at Golgotha recognized Jesus as a Son of God. Then, at the very end of the Gospel, Jesus meets the 11 in Galilee and commands them to make disciples of all nations. Does he mean every nation or just Gentile nations? Is he turning his back on Israel in the same way that Paul, at the end of the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul says that the salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles, they will listen? Both these sayings may mark stages in the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. Ironically, restricting Matthew's Great Commission only to the Gentile nations accords with more recent Christian reluctance to proselytize the Jews. More of that later. So was Matthew Jewish or anti-Jewish? Matthew inherited a prejudice against the people of Judea and Jerusalem, but as a faithful Israelite in the diaspora, he was certainly not alone. But he was faithful to the religion of the people of Israel. He upholds the Torah and places Jesus firmly in the shoes of Moses and David. He believed that the fall of Jerusalem was caused by Judea's infidelity, by not turning to Jesus. The people had brought the sack on themselves by crying out, "His blood be upon us and upon our children." The Christian movement had inherited the Torah and the religious customs of Israel. Jewish religion, now promulgated by the scribes and Pharisees, would, in Matthew's eyes, wither away. Well, quite clearly, the Jewish religion didn't wither away. Throughout the centuries, it survived persecutions, pogroms, and the last century, the Holocaust. Christianity cannot pretend that it has supplanted or superseded Jewish religion, because it patently hasn't. Today we have two religions which have grown out of the religion in Israel at the time of the Second Temple destroyed by the Romans. Furthermore, most Christians have now given up trying to convert Jews. Instead, Christians see Judaism, as a faithful expression of religion in its own right. Similarly, Jewish voices are increasingly seeing Christianity as a partner in the service of the community. What did wither on the vine was Jewish Christianity. Christians escaped from the siege of Jerusalem and established themselves at Pella in the upper Jordan Valley. They became known as the Ebionites, the poor. The church considered them heretical because they didn't accept the virgin birth. But the community didn't survive. The remnants may have become absorbed into Islam after encountering Muhammad in the Arabian desert. So how should we view Matthew's Gospel today? Matthew reminds us of the danger of using hard language to attack those different to ourselves. This language may have appeared normal as a means of public discourse in the first century. But over the centuries, his text has been used to denigrate and belittle another ethnicity and religion. Religious authors may be uplifting in describing their own faith, but often fall short of the mark when criticizing the faith of others. Matthew is no exception. The same is true in our public life when we consider modern social media. The murder of Joe Cox reminds us of the consequences of vilifying our opponents. Reflection on the use made of Matthew's Gospel should lead us to be more responsible in our use of language in public dialogue. We need to read the Gospel in context. Two religious movements fighting for the soul of Judaism after the temple was destroyed. We have seen that Matthew was always keen to claim that Scripture was fulfilled by Jesus. But we can no longer read the Gospel with any sense of superiority, especially any notion that the promises in the Hebrew Bible were exclusively fulfilled by Jesus. We can find echoes of the story of Jesus in the Hebrew Scriptures, and we can read them in that light. But what we cannot do is to claim exclusive possession of the Scriptures, which we share with our Jewish friends. Christians need humility in the face of continued vitality of the Jewish religion and culture, despite the attempts in the past to destroy it. We must read Matthew today in the multicultural context in which we all find ourselves. This should lead us to reject any suggestion that Judaism has been superseded by Christianity. It plainly hasn't been. We should affirm that Judaism is a complete religion which doesn't need to be fulfilled by Christianity. And we should avoid any systematic attempts to convert Jews. Indeed, we should embrace a theology of dialogue and learn from each other by mutual engagement. Of all the Gospels, Matthew reminds us that Jesus was a faithful Israelite. Indeed, we cannot get near to understanding Jesus if we do not place him in Israel as it was in the first century, and if we do not take the trouble to learn about the Jewish religion from our Jewish friends. This may lead us to learn about Jesus' Jewishness from scholars like Cesare Hermes. Despite its role in anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, Matthew's Gospel is now recognized as a must-read text for Jews to understand Jewish life in the first century. Jesus' ethical demands come from a distinctly Jewish matrix. They have reached wide dissemination through Christian preaching and teaching, but we should never forget that they were derived from first century Judaism. Without his Jewish background, Jesus would not have given us the Sermon on the Mount, drawing on, as he does, the prophecy of Isaiah and the Psalms. Without Matthew's formulation, we would not be able to read the Psalm today. In conclusion, Matthew's Gospel may help us to explain why two religions emerged from Israel in the first century, which are still with us in the world today. Thank God we no longer see each other in competition, but can now fruitfully learn and explore our customs and our scriptures together. Thank you.